Something subtle is unfolding beneath the surface of everyday life, and most people haven't noticed it yet. There is no announcement, no dramatic collapse, no visible rebellion. On the outside, everything looks normal. People still show up, still respond, still function. But internally, something has shifted. A quiet movement is taking place, one that doesn't march, protest, or demand attention. It simply withdraws. More and more individuals are pulling back emotionally, socially, psychologically, without fully knowing how to explain why. This phenomenon doesn't have a clear name, which is why it's so often misunderstood. It doesn't look like depression, but it's not enthusiasm either. It doesn't resemble anger, yet it carries a deep sense of finality. People aren't leaving loudly. They're leaving silently. They stop explaining themselves. They stop overgiving. They stop trying to be understood by environments that never truly listened. From the outside, this behavior appears cold, distant, even wrong. Friends say they've changed. Family says they've become hard. Society labels it withdrawal, avoidance, or emotional shutdown. But what if that interpretation is backwards? What if this growing distance isn't dysfunction, but adaptation? What if the psyche is responding intelligently to something it can no longer tolerate? Many who feel this shift struggle to articulate it. They just know that what once felt natural now feels draining. What once felt meaningful now feels empty. They aren't trying to disappear, but something inside them refuses to keep participating in the same way. This is why the rupture feels invisible. It doesn't announce itself as a crisis. It arrives as clarity, as fatigue, as a quiet refusal to keep paying an emotional cost that no longer makes sense, and those experiencing it often feel alone, because everyone else seems to still be playing by the old rules. Yet this movement is growing, slowly, silently, everywhere. If any part of this resonates with you, you're not imagining it, and you're not alone. This channel exists to explore these hidden psychological shifts with depth and honesty. Subscribe if you want to understand what's happening beneath the surface. And comment if you've felt this quiet rupture in your own life. Sometimes naming it is the first step toward clarity. Long before this shift became visible in everyday behavior, it was already mapped by those who studied the human psyche at its deepest levels. This is not a modern trend, not a generational flaw, and not a personal failure. Thinkers like Carl Jung and Mary Ainsworth described this pattern decades ago, not as an opinion, but as a recurring psychological process that appears whenever inner development reaches a certain threshold. What feels confusing on the surface has an underlying structure, and once you see that structure, fear begins to dissolve. Jung observed that as consciousness expands, the psyche naturally withdraws from environments that cannot support it. This withdrawal was not framed as avoidance, but as necessity. When an individual becomes aware of internal dynamics, projections, and unconscious contracts, remaining fully embedded in those dynamics becomes psychologically costly. The psyche responds not with collapse, but with distance. Jung saw this again and again in individuals who were not ill, not broken, but becoming more internally integrated than their surroundings allowed. Mary Ainsworth identified a parallel pattern through attachment research. She showed that when emotional systems repeatedly encounter inconsistency, misuse, or lack of attunement, they reorganize. This reorganization is not pathology, it is intelligence. The nervous system recalibrates its openness based on safety, not on ideals. Emotional withdrawal in this framework is not rejection of connection, but protection of the self when connection has become unreliable. What these frameworks share is something essential. They remove moral judgment from the experience. You are not cold. You are not antisocial. You are not failing at relationships or life. You are moving through a phase that has appeared across cultures, eras, and psychological models whenever a person outgrows the container they are in. Archetypally, this is the moment when the old strategies stop working and the psyche begins to seek conditions that can support what it has become. This is why the experience feels both isolating and strangely clarifying. Once you recognize it as a known psychological pattern, the question shifts. Instead of asking, "What is wrong with me?" the deeper inquiry becomes, "What am I growing beyond?" The fear dissolves because meaning replaces confusion. What seemed like loss reveals itself as transition. What is usually labeled as withdrawal, coldness, or emotional distance is often nothing more than the psyche protecting itself after reaching a new level of awareness. This shift is not a defect in your character, nor a failure of empathy. It is a survival mechanism. When internal development outpaces the emotional safety of the environment, the nervous system does what it is designed to do. It reduces exposure. Just as the body pulls its hand away from heat, the psyche pulls back from patterns that repeatedly cause harm, depletion, or self-betrayal. From the inside, this response is not chosen intellectually. It happens organically. You don't decide to become more distant. Distance emerges when staying open becomes too costly. The system recognizes that the old way of relating no longer aligns with what you can tolerate without damage. What once felt like generosity begins to feel like erosion. And in that moment, withdrawal becomes the most coherent response available. Social narratives often misinterpret this change because they value availability over integrity. They praise constant openness, endless patience, and emotional accessibility, even when those traits are exploited. But psychological growth changes the equation. As self-awareness deepens, the psyche refuses to keep sacrificing itself to maintain familiarity. This is not avoidance. It is integration. The system is consolidating what it has learned. Seen through this lens, emotional distance is not regression. It is progression. It is the natural consequence of internal maturation, where discernment replaces compulsion and preservation replaces overextension. The behavior that once looked like a problem reveals itself as intelligence in action. Most environments are not built on conscious choice but on repetition. Social spaces, relationships, workplaces, and even families tend to run on unconscious agreements that no one explicitly names. People learn roles early and perform them automatically. The strong one, the giver, the listener, the fixer, the agreeable one. These roles create stability, but only as long as they remain unquestioned. The system depends on predictability, not authenticity. Beneath everyday interactions, projections are constantly at play. People don't relate to who you are, but to who they need you to be in order to feel regulated themselves. Your kindness becomes a function. Your patience becomes an expectation. Your emotional availability becomes a resource others unconsciously draw from. Masks are rewarded because they keep the system comfortable. Depth is tolerated only when it doesn't disrupt the flow. These systems operate through unspoken rules. Don't change too much. Don't become inconvenient. Don't stop giving what you've always given. When someone begins to step out of their assigned role, the discomfort isn't subtle. Confusion, guilt, and resistance appear, not because the change is wrong, but because it threatens the balance the system relies on. The moment you stop performing automatically, the structure reveals itself. This is why withdrawal is often met with misunderstanding. The environment was never designed to support individuation, only participation. Once you see this, it becomes clear that the tension isn't a personal flaw. It's the friction between a developing psyche and a system that requires unconscious compliance to function. There comes a moment when something quietly clicks, and the world you've been navigating suddenly looks different. Not louder, not dramatic, just unmistakably clearer. Patterns you once tolerated without question begin to stand out. Conversations feel scripted. Reactions feel predictable. You start noticing how often emotions are deflected, how needs are avoided, how responsibility is shifted. What was once invisible becomes obvious, and with that clarity comes an irreversible change. After this point, you can't return to innocence. You see when kindness is being used as leverage. You sense when closeness is conditional. You recognize when people relate through projection rather than presence. Interactions that once felt normal now feel staged, as if everyone is playing a role they never chose consciously. You begin to notice how often people respond not to what is said, but to what they fear, expect, or need you to represent. This awareness doesn't make you superior. It makes you incompatible with denial. The effort required to pretend you don't see these dynamics becomes heavier than the discomfort of stepping back. You feel the strain of staying silent when something inside you knows better. And that's when the rupture occurs. Not because you wanted to withdraw, but because continuing to engage as before would mean betraying what you now understand. If this feels familiar, it's because this moment doesn't announce itself as awakening. It arrives as quiet dissonance, a sense that something fundamental has shifted, and there is no way to unsee what you've seen. After the rupture, a strange form of loneliness begins to take shape. You can be surrounded by people, engaged in conversations, present in familiar spaces, and still feel profoundly alone. It isn't the absence of company that creates this isolation. It's the absence of resonance. You realize that while words are being exchanged, meanings are not. What you notice, feel, and perceive no longer finds a place to land. It starts to feel as though you're speaking a different language, not intellectually but emotionally. You hear what's being said, yet you're aware of everything that isn't. Subtext becomes louder than dialogue. Silence speaks more clearly than explanation. And, over time, the effort to bridge that gap becomes exhausting. You find yourself constantly simplifying what you sense, trimming depth into something more digestible, more acceptable, more comfortable for others. This translation costs energy. Each interaction requires you to edit yourself, to soften insights, to withhold perceptions that would disrupt the surface harmony. You begin to feel tired not because people are unkind, but because the level at which connection happens no longer meets where you live internally. The loneliness isn't dramatic. It's quiet, persistent, and difficult to explain. If you felt this, you know it isn't solved by more socializing. It's the loneliness of being unseen while visible, of being present without being met. And naming it is often the first relief. Over time, this quiet loneliness turns into a deeper form of exhaustion. Not physical tiredness, but existential fatigue. Remaining in the same environments begins to demand something subtle but costly: the betrayal of your own perception. You start noticing how often you have to ignore what you sense, soften what you know, or pretend not to recognize dynamics that are now obvious to you. Staying requires you to look away from your own awareness. With that comes a gradual reduction of consciousness. Not because you want it, but because full awareness becomes incompatible with everyday interaction. You catch yourself dimming your attention, numbing your intuition, shrinking your inner responses, just to remain socially functional. It's not that you've become less conscious. It's that consciousness has become inconvenient in spaces that reward surface engagement. Performance becomes the final strain. Each interaction feels like a role you must step into. Appropriate reactions, acceptable emotions, carefully filtered responses. The self you've grown into has no real place to stand. Over time, this constant self-adjustment becomes unbearable. The psyche recognizes the cost. Withdrawal isn't chosen out of weakness or resentment. It happens because staying would require ongoing self-erasure. And when the price of belonging becomes the abandonment of your inner truth, the system responds with distance, not as rebellion, but as preservation. What you're experiencing has a name, even if it's rarely spoken. It is psychological labor, the invisible work required to sustain awareness in environments that operate unconsciously. This labor doesn't show on the surface. Others don't see it, and often you don't recognize it yourself at first. You just feel tired in a way that rest doesn't fix. That's because the exhaustion isn't coming from doing too much, but from holding too much. Every interaction requires energy, filtering projections that aren't yours, maintaining boundaries that aren't respected, regulating yourself while others remain unregulated. You're not just managing your own emotions. You're unconsciously compensating for the emotional blind spots of the environment around you. This constant adjustment carries a cost. Awareness demands containment, and containment requires energy. In unconscious spaces, this effort goes unnoticed because it's not shared. Others flow with the current. You swim against it. You stay present where others dissociate. You remain responsible where others deflect. Over time, this creates a deep energetic drain that has nothing to do with weakness or fragility. It's the natural price of consciousness without support. Once this burden is named, something shifts. The fatigue becomes intelligible. You're not failing to cope. You're performing invisible labor in a system that doesn't recognize it. And understanding this is often the moment when self-blame finally gives way to clarity. When exhaustion sets in, the instinct is to treat it as a problem to be fixed. Fatigue, apathy, and emotional withdrawal are quickly labeled as dysfunctions, signs that something is wrong. But from a psychological perspective, these states are often messages, not malfunctions. They are the body and psyche communicating a limit that has been crossed too many times. A system that is continually overstretched does not collapse immediately. It first conserves energy. Interest narrows. Emotional range contracts. The impulse to engage fades. This isn't failure. It's adaptation. Just as the body slows down to heal after injury, the psyche reduces output when its resources are being depleted without recovery. What looks like shutdown is often a protective pause. Apathy in this context is not indifference. It is discernment forced by exhaustion. The system is saying it can no longer afford to care indiscriminately. Withdrawal is not rejection of life or people. It is a refusal to continue in conditions that require constant self-abandonment. These symptoms arise not because something is broken, but because something intelligent is trying to prevent further damage. When this is understood, guilt begins to loosen its grip. There is nothing wrong with responding to overload by pulling back. Fear softens when you realize your system isn't failing you. It's signaling that it needs different conditions to function. Listening to that signal is not weakness. It's respect for your own limits. Consider the people who try to push through this exhaustion by force. One woman stayed in a work environment that demanded constant emotional availability while offering no real safety or recognition. She told herself she just needed to be stronger, more patient, more adaptable. Over time, she developed chronic fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and a persistent sense of emptiness. Medical tests showed nothing wrong. It wasn't until she stepped away, taking distance from the environment rather than herself, that her energy slowly returned. Another person remained in a long-term relationship where he was always the stabilizing force. He listened, soothed, understood, and adjusted endlessly. Leaving felt unthinkable. Loyalty had become his identity. But his body began to rebel. Sleep became restless. Anxiety increased. Joy faded. When the relationship ended, not dramatically but quietly, the symptoms eased. The relief wasn't emotional excitement, it was nervous system calm. There are countless variations of this story. People who stay out of duty, habit, or fear of being misunderstood, and slowly lose themselves. And then, when they finally reduce contact, change roles, or remove themselves from the draining context, something shifts. Clarity returns. Breath deepens. The body softens. These aren't miracles. They are confirmations. When the source of depletion is removed, the system doesn't need to defend itself anymore, and health begins where pressure ends. Across cultures and throughout history, this phase has always been recognized, even if it was described with different names. It appears as the hermit, the one who steps away not out of rejection, but out of necessity. It appears as the initiate, who must leave the familiar world in order to undergo transformation. It appears as the silent guardian, who withdraws from noise to preserve something valuable within. These figures are not symbols of isolation, but of transition. The archetype emerges at a specific moment in inner development, when the old ways of relating no longer fit, and the new self has not yet found its place. At this stage, proximity to others can interfere with integration. External voices drown out internal truth. The Psyche instinctively seeks distance not to escape life, but to prepare for a deeper engagement with it later. Seen through this lens, withdrawal stops looking like a personal flaw and starts looking like a universal passage. Many have walked this path before, even if they didn't have the language to name it. The solitude serves a function. It protects the transformation while it is still fragile. It allows clarity to form without distortion. When you recognize this pattern as archetypal, something shifts. You are no longer alone in it. You are participating in a process as old as human consciousness itself, one that asks for patience, silence, and trust, while something essential is being shaped within. It's important to clarify what this withdrawal is not. It isn't an escape from responsibility, and it isn't a rejection of people or life. There is no hidden resentment driving it, no belief that one is better, wiser, or above others. In fact, this phase often carries a deep understanding of human struggle. The distance doesn't come from judgment, but from sensitivity. Isolation, in this sense, is not chosen to avoid connection. It emerges because integration requires space. When inner changes are underway, the psyche needs silence to organize what it has learned. External demands, opinions, and expectations can fragment that process. Stepping back is not about shutting the world out, but about turning inward long enough for something new to settle. Those going through this phase often still care deeply. They feel empathy, concern, and even longing. But they no longer have the capacity to stay in environments that require constant explanation, justification, or self-adjustment. It's not hatred that creates distance. It's honesty. Pretending to be fully available when you are internally reorganizing would be a form of self-deception. Seen clearly, this withdrawal is an act of respect for the psyche's timing. Integration cannot be rushed or performed publicly. It happens quietly, away from pressure. And recognizing this removes the shame that often surrounds the need for distance, replacing it with permission to honor the process. This period of withdrawal is not empty time. It is gestation. Beneath the quiet, something is actively forming. Experiences that once felt overwhelming begin to settle into understanding. Emotions that had no space to be processed start to organize themselves. The psyche uses distance not to disconnect, but to integrate what could not be held while constantly responding to the outside world. Identity, too, enters a reorganization. Roles that once defined you lose their grip. Labels that came from expectation rather than truth begin to fall away. In the silence, you are no longer required to perform coherence for others, which allows a more honest sense of self to emerge. This isn't regression, it's consolidation. The system is deciding what stays and what no longer fits. Certain forms of clarity cannot develop in noise. Insight, discernment, and inner alignment require conditions of stillness. Without constant input, the mind can recognize patterns instead of reacting to them. Without social pressure, values can realign. What begins to take shape during this phase is not immediately visible, but it is durable. Silence here has a function. It protects what is forming from interference. It allows something essential to mature without distortion. And when this is understood, the absence of movement no longer feels like stagnation. It becomes preparation for a way of being that could not have emerged any other way. When movement begins again, it doesn't look like a return to the life that was left behind. There is no rush back to the center, no desire to re-enter the noise or reclaim old positions. The psyche knows that the conditions which required withdrawal haven't fundamentally changed. What has changed is the individual's relationship to them. The return happens at the edges, in smaller spaces, in quieter formats. Instead of large systems and constant exposure, there is selective presence. Instead of performing a role, there is authentic participation. The self that emerges from integration no longer fits into structures built on speed, image, or mass approval. It seeks environments where depth is possible without translation. This is why the return often looks invisible from the outside. It may take the form of fewer relationships, simpler work, or creative expression shared with a limited audience. The goal is not recognition but coherence, not influence, but alignment. What matters is that the environment can hold the truth of who you are without requiring fragmentation. The old roles are not resumed because they belong to an earlier version of the self. Returning to them would undo the work that was done in silence. So the re-entry is careful, conscious, and restrained. Presence becomes intentional, and in these margins, possible, connection without self-betrayal. From these conscious margins, a different kind of contribution begins to take shape. It is not loud, persuasive, or driven by the need to be seen. The individual no longer tries to convince, rescue, or awaken others. That urgency has dissolved. What replaces it is presence, a grounded way of being that speaks without insisting. Some return as guides, not through instruction, but through example. Their clarity offers orientation to those already seeking it. Others become creators, expressing insight through writing, art, or quiet work that carries depth without explanation. Some serve as curators or curators of space, holding environments where safety, honesty, and reflection are possible. And many become silent references, people whose steadiness alone reassures others that a different way of living exists. This form of contribution respects timing. It understands that awareness cannot be forced or transferred. It emerges only where readiness exists. Because of this, the impact is often subtle but profound. One conversation, one piece of work, one shared moment can carry more meaning than years of constant engagement ever did. There is no need to announce transformation. Those who resonate will find it, and those who don't were never meant to. In this way, contribution becomes sustainable. Energy is offered where it can be received, and withheld where it would be wasted. This is not withdrawal from the world, but a refinement of how one participates in it. When everything is brought together, a single truth remains clear. What you've been experiencing is not failure. You didn't withdraw because you were incapable of coping, connecting, or succeeding. And it is not rejection. You didn't turn away from life or people out of bitterness or fear. This process is also not abandonment. Nothing essential was left behind. What fell away were conditions that could no longer support who you have become. This shift reflects psychological evolution. As awareness deepens, the psyche naturally reorganizes its priorities, boundaries, and investments. What once felt necessary loses relevance. What once drained you becomes intolerable. This is not loss, but refinement. The system is moving toward coherence, reducing fragmentation, and protecting what has matured internally. Seen this way, distance becomes a sign of alignment, not disconnection. Silence becomes integration, not absence. Change stops looking like collapse and begins to reveal itself as completion of a developmental phase. The psyche is not retreating, it is advancing. Understanding this reframes the entire journey. Instead of asking why you no longer fit where you once belonged, the more honest question becomes what level of truth you are now oriented toward. And in that orientation, what appeared as endings are revealed as the natural consequences of growth taking its next step. If you feel this pull, you're not imagining it. If you've noticed yourself growing quieter, more selective, less willing to explain or justify what you sense, it's because something inside you has shifted. If being around certain people or environments now feels heavier than it once did, it's not because you've lost your capacity for connection. It's because your awareness no longer fits comfortably where it used to. If you're stepping back without anger, without drama, but with a firm inner knowing, that matters. If you find yourself choosing fewer conversations, fewer obligations, fewer emotional investments, it's not apathy, it's discernment. Your system is responding to what it has learned. And if part of you feels conflicted, relieved, and unsettled at the same time, that's a sign you're standing at a threshold, not falling away. You may recognize that you're no longer willing to shrink your perceptions to keep others comfortable. You may feel the cost of pretending everything is fine when it isn't, and you may sense that continuing as before would require you to abandon something essential in yourself. That recognition doesn't come to everyone. It comes when development reaches a certain depth. If this speaks to you, know that you're not alone in it. Others are moving through the same quiet transition, not loudly, not visibly, but deliberately. And what you're responding to isn't loss. It's an internal call toward coherence. You are allowed to pause. You don't need a crisis, a diagnosis, or a dramatic reason to slow down. If your system is asking for stillness, that request is valid on its own. You are allowed to become quieter, to respond less, to take space without turning it into a statement. Silence does not require justification. You are allowed to step back from people, environments, and expectations that drain more than they give. This isn't abandonment or cruelty. It's self-respect. Preserving your energy is not selfish when that energy has been consistently depleted. You don't owe constant access to your inner world, especially when it has not been treated with care. You are also allowed to stop explaining yourself. Not everyone needs to understand your process. Some distances exist to protect something still forming. Guilt often appears when old patterns of overgiving try to reassert control, but guilt is not a reliable indicator of wrongdoing. It's often just the echo of roles you've outgrown. Taking space is not failure. It's listening. Pausing is not avoidance. It's regulation. And preserving your energy is not withdrawal from life. It's creating the conditions where life can be met honestly again, when the time is right. At a certain point, distance stops being something that simply happens to you and becomes something you choose with intention. Withdrawal turns into a conscious act, not a collapse, not a retreat driven by fear, but a deliberate movement inward. This is where separation gains purpose. You are no longer just stepping away from noise. You are creating a container where clarity can form. Silence in this phase is not emptiness. It has direction. It is used to observe rather than react, to listen rather than explain. Without constant stimulation, the mind can recognize its own patterns. Emotions settle enough to be understood instead of managed. What once felt overwhelming becomes intelligible when given space. Solitude becomes a laboratory. In it, you experiment with new boundaries, new rhythms, and new ways of relating to yourself. You notice what strengthens you and what weakens you. You test which impulses are genuine and which were inherited from expectation. This isn't isolation for comfort. It's solitude for truth. When approached this way, withdrawal becomes initiation, a threshold you cross consciously, knowing that what you are stepping into cannot be accessed while you remain entangled in old dynamics. The distance is not an end. It is the setting where something essential is refined, with patience and intent. This space is not for everyone, and it isn't meant to be. It exists for those who recognize themselves in this quiet transition, for those who are no longer searching for quick answers or loud motivation, but for understanding that unfolds over time. If you are walking this path, you don't need to be persuaded. You already know why you're here. If these reflections resonate, you're welcome to stay. Subscribing is simply a way of continuing the conversation, of moving alongside others who are navigating the same inner terrain with patience and honesty. There is no rush and no pressure to change, just presence. You're also invited to leave a comment, not to explain yourself, but to mark recognition. Sometimes writing a single sentence is enough to acknowledge where you are in the process. Others reading may see themselves in your words and feel less alone. This channel isn't about fixing or convincing. It's about accompaniment, a steady place to explore psychological depth without performance or urgency. If this feels aligned, join quietly. The work happens at its own pace, and those who belong here will recognize it without being called. If you find yourself moving more quietly through the world, know that this silence is not empty. It carries meaning. What you are not saying, not explaining, not offering, has weight because it is intentional. Your withdrawal is not an absence of life, but a different way of holding it. Something in you understood that noise was interfering with truth, and it chose stillness instead. Your distance serves a function. It protects what is still integrating, what cannot yet be exposed without distortion. Stepping back allows the psyche to complete work that cannot happen under constant observation or demand. What looks like pause from the outside is often deep internal movement from within, and this separation is not pointless. It is preparing something. Clarity, alignment, and a more honest way of being take shape in conditions of quiet. You are not falling behind. You are not disappearing into nothingness. You are allowing something essential to form without pressure. There is no need to rush this process or announce it. Let it unfold at its own rhythm. When movement returns, it will carry a different quality, less reactive, more grounded, more true. Until then, trust the silence. It knows what it's doing.